Hey, it's Tom Saviella here. I hope you enjoyed our show, Talking Maine with the Bowtie Boys. It's a resource that we're able to bring to you through Mount Blue TV. If you would consider making a donation to Mount Blue TV, you can go to the website and it'll take you right to that place where you can do that. Let's keep Mount Blue TV going. It's a gem for the area and helps our show stay on the air. Welcome to Talking Maine with the Bowtie Boys. I don't even know where I am today, Tom. Chandler Woodcock's off someplace, probably in Spain. Who knows? But I have my special friend, Tom Ward.
Hey,
The other Tom
thank
Ward.
you, Tom.
It's great
Yes,
to
the
have
other
you back
Tom
again.
Ward.
A retired historian. That's kind of
Yeah,
interesting.
that's kind of fun.
I just met the archaeologist up here from the area that she's going to come and do a show with me to talk a little bit and starts a history part. It'd be interesting
Yeah.
to watch. But we're going to continue our little trip to Spain,
Right.
where you found something that kind of surprised you. I remember I asked last time, what's really surprised you? And you kind of touched on it a little bit. So why don't you go into the details of it?
Yeah, I think, when we talked last time, we mostly talked about my walking up the Camino Portugués, part of the way to Santiago de Compostela that a lot of people walk nowadays, sort of like the Appalachian Trail. I did 166 miles of it. And as I'm going along, I've worked in Spain. I've made some trips to Spain before and noticed some things, but never really put anything together. And it gradually began to dawn on me, wow, this part of Spain is really got a lot of similarities to Ireland, Scotland, Wales. It's pretty Celtic. And that was a surprise to me. I knew that Western Spain was very green. It had temperatures like Maine. Seafood was a big deal. Dairy was a big deal. But the Celtic aspect of it, I didn't really get.
So how did they get there? I mean,
well, let's talk about that.
Okay.
Maybe just go to the first slide. So this slide is just showing you the Celtic nations that still exist they're called Celtic nations, they're not really all nations, in Europe. And you can see that the obvious ones we know about: Scotland, Ireland, Wales,
right.
But then also Cornwall in southwestern England is Celtic, and Brittany in the far northwest of France is. And then there are three regions in Spain. The red one is Galicia, the yellow one is Asturias, and then there's another
Orange
color,
one.
maybe
It's
a
orange.
blue
No, that's
or
pretty,
something,
Blue.
Cantabria.
Yeah.
Cantabria is actually the least Celtic of them. Asturias and Galicia are more Celtic, and we'll talk about why that is. But in fact, the name, if you go way back to Roman times, the name they gave most of Spain, more than half of it, was Galicia. Okay, but they spelled it slightly differently than the Galicia that we know in Spain today, and it was a much larger area. And that's because, like the Gauls in France, Spain was occupied by all these Celtic people. So let's just go ahead with the story here.
Okay.
The next slide. When I had planned the walk, my idea was I would need to recover afterwards.
Yeah.
And obviously, I did it alone. So my family came over afterwards. We went up into the high mountains, and this is actually the house we rented. Wow. Believe it or not, I highly recommend it to anyone who wants an inexpensive. It was like $900 for the week with 3 bedrooms.
Oh my goodness.
And spectacular views. And we knew that this area was very scenic. It's on the edge of something called the Picos de Europa. There's this T-shirt that says Picos de Europa 2, which are these very high peaks, which are really spectacular. If we could go to the next slide. When I say that these high peaks are really spectacular, this is northern Spain.
Northern Spain.
Okay, and it looks like Switzerland,
Yeah,
doesn't
it does.
It looks like
Absolutely.
Heidi should be running across
Like,
the
there's
field.
Heidi's house right
This
there.
is a meadow up above the village where our house was. I mean, this is exactly where we were staying. And if you go to the next picture, this is one of the most famous peaks in the Picos de Europa. It's this one that's again profiled here. It's called the Naranjo de Bulnes. And you can see it's got a little bit of like the Dolomites in Italy, which is, it's a limestone. The erosion has occurred all around this sort of shaft that's in the middle.
Right.
You see?
So that's a resistance.
And that's a resistant bit of rock. So you get these incredible shapes up there. So this is why we decided to go up there. We thought, cool, you know, I would need to recover. This would be fun. There would be short walks. It would be a good place to stay. But what was interesting was to start to absorb the local culture and notice things about it. So if we go to the next slide. So this is an area where people still have lots of cows and sheep, and they grow apples. Our village had about 60 year-round residents, and they would take the herds up into the high mountains. So that's what you see here. Because even in June, there's still snow. But you can see there's sort of a stone hut there, which is in the back, and then the cow with a hiker who's actually walking right past.
So it's not the tender of the cow.
No, that's just a hiker with a backpack going by. The Brits in particular, a lot of British people go hiking in this area. It's sort of got spectacular hikes, and they love it. But, and I have to say, I was so tired from walking the Camino that I maybe did 2 or 3 miles a day, and that was about it for me. But it was a fun area to wander around, precisely for this kind of very dramatic landscape. I mean, the rocks going up above these meadows.
Now, the meadows fenced, or is that just kind of a common
No, they
ground?
are actually fenced, but they move them an awful lot around. So the house that we were on, often we had sheep come right in several times. They would put a string over the driveway so that the cows wouldn't come in. But yeah, they're moving them a lot because you can see it's pretty high, and that grass,
once it's chewed on,
it
goes down.
Goes down.
Takes a while
so
to
let's
recover.
go to the next one. And of course, what we loved about it is there are great things to eat. So on the left, that Kashigan, I'm sure I can even pronounce the X in the local language correctly, because these areas, Asturias and Galicia, actually speak a variant of Spanish. By the time you get to Galicia, it's halfway to Portuguese or French, I don't know which. And so they use the X a lot. So Jesus, for example, is X-E-S-U. Jesus. And so this is Kashigan, is the cheese on the left, which was made by this lovely woman up the hill from our house. And we would go up there, and she makes cow cheese, which is the top, and then goat and sheep cheese. The really famous cheese that you can get at like Whole Foods in Portland that costs an arm and a leg is on the right, and that's called Cabrales Blue Cheese. But it's right from here, right from this same area. We were about, I'd say 5 miles away from Arenas de Cabrales. So the other thing that's great in this area, if we could go to the next slide, is cider.
Cider.
So the weird thing is, we think of Spain as a wine drinking country. They drink wine in this part of Spain, but they drink an awful lot of cider and an awful lot of beer. We'll talk more about the beer. But cider is almost a religion in this area. And you can see these people are all dressed up in these green outfits. Some of them have almost Ku Klux Klan-y-like green pointy caps. And they're marching under a banner. And this is an annual cider festival,
St. Joseph,
which they take terribly, terribly seriously. And in fact, the banner says that to drink cider, I drink cider, therefore I am, is basically the translation from the Latin.
Oh.
So it's very important to them, the cider. And I like cider too. Yeah. But of course, what they're talking about here is hard cider.
I was going to say hard cider. So this really is an apple region.
Apple orchards everywhere.
Because it would be then, like you said, something similar to Maine. At one time, we had orchards everywhere.
Absolutely. I was actually struck the whole time by the extent to which this area reminded me of the Maine of my childhood, because there are dairy farms everywhere and there are apple orchards everywhere, and that was the Maine I grew up in.
Yes,
you know? Yeah. And so you don't actually have a lot of forests below the really steep mountains. Now, if we go to the next slide, this is where it began to dawn. This was one of those moments that really dawned on me. We were sitting, it was St. Anthony of Padua Day, and we're sitting at an outside cafe drinking cider, and the bands come marching by, and they're, okay, wait a second, they're playing bagpipes and they're in plaids, and some of them are in kilts.
And they're speaking Pig Latin Spanish.
Well, actually, they're speaking the local language,
I
which
see.
is Asturiano in this case, or Gallego in the next region. But so on the left, you see them coming, and on the right, you see them going. And it's probably hard to discern that they've got the bagpipes and so forth, but they do. That were very loud, massed bagpipe bands turned out to be a feature of this area. And you sit there and say, where does this come from? Now, the Spanish word for bagpipe is gaita. And actually turns out to be very popular, playing the bagpipe.
So is this holiday, was
Yeah.
it just by circumstance that you were there during, or is it really an all-year celebration?
No, that was just a particular day, which I guess is the feast day of St. Anthony of Padua. There is no church in this town devoted to St. Anthony of Padua. So basically, they look for any excuse to have a party, and when a Saint's Day comes along,
They party.
They party. And they bring out the bagpipes and the kilts, and they go hog wild. And we're drinking cider and beer. If you go to the next slide, the point about, on the left, you've got a guy who's wearing a Galician kilt. Now, that is a Spanish guy from Galicia, the northwesternmost region. On the right, you've got a woman with the bagpipe, and she's wearing the plaid skirt. She's actually from Asturias. So in general, the kilts and plaids, tartans, in Asturias are green, and in general they're blue in Galicia. But they're they look like Scotland. They look.
So are they family tartans, or are they just general tartans?
No, they're not clan tartans.
Clan
They're
tartans,
more, they're more village or town area tartans. It's as if Franklin County had a tartan, okay? So we go to the next slide. One of the other things that I really began to notice quite early, because I appreciated having Irish bars all along the Camino, was that there were Irish bars all along the Camino. And so on the top left, you can see an example of an Irish bar in Galicia. And on the lower right, what also was cool, that's a very, very good beer store in Santiago de Compostela. We spent a lot of time talking with the guy who runs it. But it's devoted to craft beer. The interesting thing is, an IPA there is called an IPA, IPA, but they say IPA, and that's still not very common.
Oh, no, really?
The craft beers they produce are more stouts and ales. And so that reflects really the tradition of Ireland.
That's correct, yeah, like the Guinnesses that are on there.
Exactly,
that kind of
and
beer.
Guinness is quite popular. So if we go to the next slide, this is actually the football team or soccer team from Vigo, and they're the Celta. They're literally named for a Celt. And actually, so that's Vigo, and then the football team in near the other really big city in northwestern Spain is La Coruña, or A Coruña, depending on which language we're speaking, Spanish or Gallego. And that one, they wear the Saltaire, the cross of St. Andrew, as if they're got the Scottish flag on them. So now we go to the next page.
So let me stop there, just about the history. So their football is soccer.
Yes.
And so imagine as you drove around that area, there are all kinds of soccer fields.
Oh yeah, and the other really great thing is there are so many levels of soccer. So even the big professional teams like that one, they have like 5 grades of soccer in the same club. But when you're in a really small, our little village, 60 people, they didn't have a football team. But the little town down the hill, which probably had, it was not bigger than Mount Vernon, it was probably the size of Vienna, okay? The size of Vienna had a football team, Wow. And again, that's like Maine years ago in the sense of baseball.
Yeah. Every town
had a baseball team, right?
Yep.
And that's still the case there. So let's go to the next slide. This is, it's all in Spanish, but it's showing, whether he's Neanderthal or from Planet of the Apes, it's showing a Celtic warrior. So now you could understand why the local football team would want to be the Celta, because they're trying, see, that's it's saying warrior the translation Guerrero Celta Galicia is a Galician Celtic warrior. Okay, and that's why the football team is named for the Celta. So now let's go to the next slide. This sort of explains, at one time, that whole area that's baby blue was Celtic. Far northern Scotland, it turns out, was occupied by the Picts even before the Celts, but I don't know what happened to the Picts. But eventually what happened is, and let's go to the next slide, waves of migrating, invading people pushed the Celts in Spain, as happened in the British Isles, to the far northwest. So this is the far northwest of Spain. And what you see with the brown peaks, those are mountains that are above a certain level. So you can sort of see that what happens is they form a defensive wall.
Oh,
and
okay. So they kind of protected themselves.
Yeah, exactly. To the northwest, you have these Celts hanging on, and to the southeast, you've got first the Carthaginians, then the Romans, then the Goths and the Germans, and then eventually the Moors, the Arabs and the Moors. So this area of Spain is not at all like the kind of Spain that we're used to thinking about, you know, with Alhambra kind of architecture and castanets and flamenco and so forth. It's totally different. So now let's go to the next slide. This actually shows, and this was the most interesting thing to me. I'm walking along, and then periodically you see signs, oh, go this way to a castro or another kind of archaeological site. We'll come to them. This is an archaeological site. You can see the gate into the Celtic fortress is in the middle, and then you have these circular, there's actually two walls on either side, and then beyond them all these circular stone ruins. This is what's called a castro, or a hill fort. There still are some towns and cities in northwestern Spain called castro this, castro that, but for most part, castros are abandoned settlements. And if we go to the next slide, this shows it more clearly. Here are the circular ruins of what were thatched stone oval dwellings.
So they had this is their basement, if you will, and then so you had the sticks and the thatch.
Actually, this is the first floor.
Oh, it's the first floor.
And they didn't have much of a basement. So now if we go to the next slide, they're all the way down to the coast, but they're almost always on a hilltop. This is one Castro Barona, which is quite difficult actually to get to. I don't know why the water level keeps rising. So it used to be fairly easy to walk out there, and now you're basically scrambling over barnacles and rocks to get out there. But it's pretty cool right by the ocean. But if you go to the next one, this one, Monte de Santa Tecla, they actually have a restoration of one of the houses, and you can see it's pretty much round. It's got the thatched peaked roof, and it almost is like an igloo, but Celtic style. Right? Yeah. And this is very similar to traditional ancient Celtic dwellings in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, so forth.
So this is that was their home.
That's their home. That's a whole family would be living in there. Yeah, pretty amazing. And then the farm animals. Luckily, this part of Spain, although it gets a lot of snow higher up, so as long as you're maybe at 1,000 to 2,000 feet, it's not that bad. I mean, so you come down from the mountain to a valley or to the edge of because even those very high mountains I was showing earlier, they're within 20 miles of the ocean. They go right up. And so there's enough variation that the winters are not so severe right by the ocean. If we go to the next slide, what's fascinating is this is a more modern house. This is actually a very famous Pelosa, it's called, which is the style that evolved in the medieval period into the early modern period. This is right on the Camino Frances, the famous Camino de Santiago that comes from Spain, from France across northern Spain. And this is photographed an awful lot. That's the door in the middle. And that is really the shape. And so what's interesting is that from those original oval small dwellings evolved these much, much bigger, stretched out buildings. And in this particular case, it makes an awful lot of sense. This is at about 2,500 feet, and the wind up there is something amazing. Okay. So you can see it's almost like a sail, that thatched roof. So it's just shedding the wind. Yeah. Right. So go to the next one.
Will the whole family live in that?
Yeah, the whole family lived in there. And you can see you hunker down. There are not a lot of openings in order to keep the heat in. So these are more right in that same village, and they're none of them round anymore. They're often not even oval or oblong. They're, the stone just makes its own shape, and it's thatched. Okay, let's go to the next one. The other cool thing all along the route are these dolmens. And so here's someone standing next to a dolmen, which is right off the Camino. And a dolmen is basically, if we go to the next slide, it's a tomb or a religious site. The Druids used to worship at these. So it's almost like an altar, and someone is usually buried under it. There have been quite a few golden helmets and shields and so forth recovered from these sites.
Some group of people have picked up that top stone and
Oh
put it on.
yeah,
Oh my
just
goodness.
like Stonehenge. These dolmens, but these are only about human height and not quite human height. So either you were a shorter human, which a lot of them were then, or you're crouching to go in because it's basically a burial site. Go to the next one. There are a whole bunch that are all along. I mean, they're just all along, and they often look like tables, right? But they're really burial sites.
Somebody is under all of those sites.
Or you often is under them. Sometimes they just seem to have, it's hard for us to know what the Druids did, so sometimes there's just some sort of religious thing going on there. If you go to the next one, then you get these carvings, these pictographs all on the right. You can see the deer.
Yeah.
On the left, there are a whole bunch of just circles. These, again, are right along. I mean, you're directed to go off and look at these, but they're right along the road, along the trails that people are walking, but they're very accessible, and they're all over northern Spain, the Celtic stone art. Now we go to the next one. You also get these amazing, they're called menhirs. Now this is actually a modern menhir. Someone put a whole field of them together, but menhirs are basically just these standing stones. And unfortunately, when you do the pictures of the individual standing stones, they're sort of dull. So I picked one of the ones that's
So the Druids stood these stones up,
yeah.
and somehow got them in the ground, dug them
And
in.
they meant something in terms of, and everyone argues about this, I mean, same as Stonehenge, was it for a solar calendar?
Yeah, right.
Was it some kind of religious? So no one really knows, and this is the same thing going on in northwestern Spain. So now we go to the next slide, and actually what happened is some of these are incorporated into churches. This is the Pedron, it's called. This is supposedly the stone that St. James stepped on when he landed in Galicia, and a massive church has been built over it. You can see the linen from the altar is hanging over it. So now this particular altar is constructed because you can see the stone that he stepped on, which is a menhir. But so what it signifies is that basically the church has taken over what was already a religious site for the Druids and turned it into a church, right? Celebrating St. James. This is one of the most famous sites along the Camino Portugues going up to Santiago de Compostela. And amazing, there's this menhir right there. I mean, this pagan stone.
It's got a shape to it. Is that because people have touched it, or is it just...
Good question. You know, that shape looks pretty weird.
Weird, yeah.
Yes, it does. Next slide. So this is my favorite pilgrimage site. This is the second most pilgrimage site in all of northwestern Spain, at least. It's Santo Andre, or San Andres, but Santo Andre in Gallego, de Teixedo. And that's the church, and people walk hundreds of miles or scores of miles to get there. I didn't. But I drove.
Oh,
but,
good man.
Yeah.
Smart man.
And you can see it's right by the ocean. There's the coast
I see
beyond.
it in the back,
Now, if we go inside, I'm sorry. Teixedo is named for the yew tree. And there's a big yew tree in the vicinity. There used to be groves of them, and yews for the Druids and for the Celts were very sacred trees. And same, our notion that they, sort of speak to the life after death and longevity. Next one. This is inside. It looks like a typical sort of Spanish church, but next one. you start looking around, there are all these weird votives going on. Upper left, you can see wax like legs and boots and people. And lower right, all those colored things, those are made of bread. Some of them are daisies, some of them are boats, some of them are, let's see.
Flowers.
Flowers, hands. All of them you are an offering of a certain kind. I couldn't quite figure out, but you're supposed to throw them into the water and then your wish will be granted, which is pre-Christian. This is a very pre-Christian notion that you would make a pilgrimage there and do this kind of offering. Next one. And you're also supposed to drink from this fountain, despite the fact that the church is up above, but this fountain where people are and they're drinking, it says this water's not drinkable. No, non-potable. You're not supposed to drink it, but all these pilgrims are drinking it because if you drink of that water, you're going to be healed. So it's sort of a fascinating place. Evidently, it was a Celtic druidical site long before Christianity, and then these traditions have perpetuated themselves there, which is kind of fascinating. And the next slide, that people also bring rocks along with them, as they do on the Camino, and drop them. But this is a pile, it's a sacred cairn, or the word in Spanish is miodoro. Look how high that is.
Yeah, right.
How many rocks have been carried up there by those pilgrims. So next slide. This is second to last. There's a saying in Spanish, which I won't even try to do the Spanish there, but it basically means if you don't go to Santo André de Teixeira or San Andrés de Teixeira while you're alive, you're going to make a visit there in another form after you're dead. So there's a belief that if in the afterlife, you have to go there. So you better go there now, make your offerings, and exactly, preempt the whole process. So the last point I wanted to make, the last slide, that's a view from there. There's a wonderful terrace in front of the church. You're looking out over the Atlantic. And I thought, really, if you have to come back here after you're dead, this isn't such a bad place to come back to. I mean, So anyway, I just thought that place was pretty amazing.
What about the music itself? Was it more was it Celtic music, or was it?
The bagpipes certainly were.
But the other background music.
Oh, no, and background music was probably the same as here. I mean, my favorite thing, I think I mentioned this last time, was when there was a band, but it was a New Orleans-style jazz band in that particular town, which I thought was also weird. And they kept playing Proud Mary at the religious festival. And, not with the words, and I kept thinking, whoa. But so you hear a lot of different kinds of music. Most of it is modern, and country and western is quite popular. American country and western is quite popular.
So Tom, where's the next trip? Where are you planning now? For our next show in another year or so, where are you going?
Well, I think this winter we're going to go down to Guatemala.
Oh.
And there are a couple of places we want to spend some time there. One is Antigua, which is the old colonial capital, but mostly we want to stay up on this lake, this volcanic. It's the collapsed crater of a volcano, and a very deep lake called Atitlan. That I want to spend some time on. It has its own special, weird religious traditions.
Wow, you're gonna be you have to come back on the show and tell us about that trip. That would be great.
Thank you. It would be fun.
Tom, this is great. I am fascinated with what you've done here and sharing this with all of us, sharing it with Henry. Henry hung around the whole time, which is unusual. This is great. Tom, I want to thank you for coming on the show. This is great. Now Henry's jealous when I shook your hand. That was great. Tom, before we forget, we should put Tom's name and phone number up here because he said if you had any questions about it, they'd give him a call.
Certainly that house, I highly recommend it, Casa Osborne. It's actually an English family, and that house they built specially in the local style. It's terrific.
Wow, cool. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in with Talking Men with the Bowtie Boys, and we'll see you next week.